big episode on how to fix different situations that you'll eventually encounter all of these. So,
And it's good to have a list like this or your notes or whatever handy, because when you're in the session and shit hits the fan, it's like great to just have a couple of solutions. This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hein, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you today, buddy?
I'm great, man. We're up a little bit earlier than usual, but this is a nice way to start the day always, so I'm excited.
Yeah, me too.
How are you?
Pretty good. I've told you before we started the episode that I'm feeling a little burnt out at the moment because of all this course thing that we've been talking about, and like I'm on a semi-vacation, but not really because I have to work on things, which is always kind of tricky. But it's been good to spend a little more time with the family this week, so all good.
Yeah.
Funny enough, I've listened to an episode of the Six Figure Home Studio podcast that we both listened to today, and Brian, the host, talks about like how he's feeling burnt out right now, and he goes through something like this kind of every summer. And I thought back the last couple of years, and it's actually pretty similar for me. Whenever, like in summer, when there's a lot of things that you can do in your personal life and with the family and everything, when that kind of private, like free time stress, if you call it that way, like if that adds to the actual workload and stress, that's also a period of time where I kind of feel burned out sometimes. So yeah, it was funny to hear that on the podcast today. But yeah,
it's a good point. I've got like March is like my yearly midlife crisis. Around January, February, I decide to start working on something totally new. And then around March, I'm like, I kind of let this become all consuming, and that was not the goal. Okay. So I have to sort it out.
Okay, but you're feeling good at the moment, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Things are awesome right now.
Awesome. Cool. That's good to hear. Well, let's jump right into it today. We have an episode on basically a troubleshooting episode. So we go through a list of things that can potentially go wrong and often do go wrong. And we go through this list of frequently asked questions and problems that come up when people record. And we try to give you as many answers to those questions and problems as possible, solutions to those problems. And it's kind of a what to do when things go wrong episode, because things will go wrong. Like they do all the time. Even like in a professional setting, some things just go wrong, and the more experience you have, you just know what to do when those things come up. And this could be a very, very valuable episode, actually, I think. And I suggest, if you're listening to this, that you grab like, I don't know, pen and paper or a note app or something like this, because it's going to be a lot of things that we go through pretty quickly, a lot of solutions, a lot of tips and tricks. So maybe you want to take some notes, make some notes of things. So yeah, that would be a good episode to do this, I guess.
Definitely. Great idea. Taking notes on anything is a good way to just learn more.
Yeah. I'm big on this. Like I never did it for a long period of my life, and I kept forgetting valuable things that I learned. But once I started just writing them down, even the act of writing it down helps remember it a lot. So,
yeah, that's the only reason I ever write notes. I never read them.
Yeah.
Like ever. I've never gone back to read them. That's not true. I guess a couple times, but almost always it's just the act of writing it down helps me like internalize the information better.
Yeah. Just
lock it in.
Quick side note: do you keep a journal or something like this? Do you do journaling or something?
No, I don't. But I've been thinking that I totally should.
That's a thing that I found very helpful as well. Like I do that in the morning and in the evening, just 5 minutes or even just 1 minute, just a couple of sentences. And I've got this journaling app called Day One that I use, which gives you kind of templates where you just answers a couple of questions every day. And just the act of sitting down, thinking about those questions every single day and writing it down without ever reading it again, but just writing it down, it kind of helps. And it's a cool habit I found for myself. So.
Fun fact, I just wrote down Day One journal app.
Yeah.
I make notes as we have our own podcast.
You see, works great. Awesome. So, let's go into this. Let's get into this. I kind of categorize this into like I put the things down into like 3 categories. One is like technical issues, which are most of the time pretty easy to fix. Then there are kind of tone problems. There is often not one solution, but we give some suggestions for solutions for those things. And then there's a third category, which is kind of arrangement problems, because sometimes it's not the individual tone that doesn't work, or sometimes it's not a technical problem, but sometimes things just get in the way of each other. And that's the third category here.
Big episode on how to fix different situations that you'll eventually encounter all of these. So
yeah, exactly. And it's good to have a list like this or your notes or whatever handy, because when you're in the session and shit hits the fan, it's like great to just have a couple of solutions.
Yes, and even just knowing the terminology, so getting familiar with some of the words we're going to be using in this will help you be able to Google up solutions and stuff like that. If you don't know what it's called, it's really hard to find help.
Oh yeah, true. All right, let's start with the technical issues. I'll just start with the first one, and that I wrote down. And this is very easy fix. No signal from your mic. So you plugged in your mic into your interface, and you want to sing into it or record something, and there's no signal. If you're using a condenser mic, problem could be you didn't turn on phantom power. So that's
definitely. Yeah, phantom power, easy one to forget, for sure. Because like your default's normally turning that off on your channel strip, and then so you have to remember to turn it on when you need it. Another thing though is just double checking your patching, so making sure it actually is going into the right channel. So despite having phantom power on and the gain cranked up on the preamp you think it's in, it could just be on the next channel over, and you mistakenly got it mixed up when you were plugging it in. So double check your routing.
Yeah, totally. And that kind of, we could jump to the next point on this list here, and this is like no signal in your DAW, which could be because of the routing, because you've assigned the wrong input channel to the channel you want to record on. So
also very common.
Yeah.
I still do that.
Yeah, me too. Actually, every time before we record this podcast, I have to check this because I'm switching interfaces, and sometimes there's an input assigned to the track that's currently not active or on another interface or something like this. So I have to choose the right interface, the right audio device first in the DAW settings, and then assign the right input of that interface to the actual channel. So, yeah.
Yeah. So double check the input and the output.
And the output as well. Yeah, exactly. Because there could be signal on the channel, but you might not hearing anything. That might not be hearing anything, and that's because you haven't assigned an output or the wrong output, or it's muted or something like that.
Yeah, and you'll know that's happening because you'll see input on the fader of that channel, like the metering inside your DAW or your preamp. Like if your preamp has any faders metering, you might see that you're getting signal there. So that kind of helps you narrow down how far it's reaching. You're going to want to look for these indicators to see, okay, well, it's definitely hitting the preamp. I can see lights happening there. And then I can see lights inside my DAW, but I don't see lights on my master meter. So something's going on there. We know it's between that point B and point C kind of thing. And just break it down until you know where it's probably happening, and that'll help you hopefully locate it.
Yes. Also, there is a thing, I don't know about other DAWs, but in Cubase and I think in Pro Tools as well, you have to arm like the track. So you have to enable the record function on that track, and so that when you hit record, that it actually records. And if you don't do that, you might hit record, but it doesn't record anything. Yeah. So that's another one.
Yeah. There's in Pro Tools, there's a record enabled, which you need to even pass audio. But there's also an input monitor, which will let you hear the track but not record it. So you have to be careful.
Yeah, same in Cubase. Yeah, the monitoring. Next thing here, it could be that you are hearing kind of a weird delay or a phasey sound or something like that. And that could be because you've enabled this input monitoring button, but it could be that you have enabled the monitoring through the DAW, but also maybe direct monitoring through your interface or the software of the interface, and that those two get mixed, and one has a slight latency or something, and you hear kind of this weird phasey sound. So that could be the case. So you should always either enable monitoring through the DAW or direct monitoring before the DAW, one or the other.
Yeah. Essentially, if you have the same sound coming from two different sources and they're not perfectly synced up, it will sound weird and phasey and usually undesirable.
Yeah, exactly. So that could be a problem. Also, with some interfaces, they have a loopback function. My RME interface has something like that. So if you enable that function, the main output gets routed back to inputs 1 and 2. They have that because their analyzer software that comes with the interface gets signal that way. So you need to enable that in order for the analyzer to work, but then inputs 1 and 2 don't work anymore. And you can use it for other things as well. But if you have that loopback enabled, it could be that you're hearing it twice. You could monitor channel 1 and you hear also the loopback from the output being routed back to channel 1. So that's also a thing.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Mine does not have that.
Yeah, mine has that. It's pretty handy, but it has caused problems for me as well because I haven't checked that button and I was wondering why I was hearing things twice until I saw that the loopback was enabled. So
great moment to say, read your manuals for your gear. Because if you didn't know that was a feature, you would never figure it out.
Yeah.
You'd be like, what is going on? This is so weird.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like manuals are, like, do you read, when you buy a new plugin, do you read the manual of it?
I do now, yes. And it has been such a good decision. And it's not like I sit down and put an hour in. I just skim through it, make sure I'm not going to read how the ratio works on every compressor because it's the same on every compressor. Yeah. But, often, especially nowadays, there'll be like a plugin with weight or focus on this new compressor I got. It says weight or focus, pawn shop comp, so good. But weight or focus, I'm like, okay, well, what does that actually mean? Those are arbitrary words. And by looking on there, they're pretty much EQs.
Cool. Yeah, I have to look into this one. I've heard a lot of good things about it, but I haven't got it yet. And but people seem to love it, the pawn shop. So yeah.
Yeah, it's fun.
And then I actually discovered features of plugins like years after I got them. So reading the manual can be very, very helpful.
Oh yeah. There's some plugins that are so advanced that I'm still finding features even after reading the manual. I just didn't read it thoroughly enough. Like the fab filter stuff, for example, I didn't know you could have the sidechain have a little detection circuit that you can move wherever you want. It's so cool.
Yeah, exactly. Things like that. Sometimes you have to expand some weird menu that's hidden or something, and then exactly.
Yeah, it's great.
Awesome. All right. Then also a monitoring thing is the latency, very common issue, and I get questions about that all the time. Actually, this week I got a quote request from someone who said he's basically ready with his song and he wants it to be mixed, but he needs to record some guitar overdub and he has some latency issues that he just can't figure out. So this stuff comes up a lot and people ask about this a lot. And there can be a number of reasons for latency. So the obvious one, I think, is the buffer size, at least to me. So if you have the buffer size set high in your DAW and you're monitoring through the DAW, then your computer takes some extra time to process everything, which gives you more CPU power or more CPU resources to process everything. But that will cause latency, of course. And so you have to lower the buffer size in order to get lower latency.
Yeah. In layman terms, you're just giving your computer more time to think with a higher buffer, which is great when you are mixing and doing heavy processing, but pretty unusable when you're trying to record because you need like instant feedback from the sound you're putting into it so that you can perform and play. So lowering the buffer will solve that. That's usually the issue. You just forgot to lower the buffer after a mix kind of thing. You're like, oh, it's pretty obvious. Like I do that all the time. I mean, it's not that I forgot, but I just test it and I could hear that it's set wrong. So I just go change it. It's kind of like a constantly going to that menu and changing the buffer. Another thing that can cause this though is some plugins. Plugins are getting better and better. Computers are getting better and better. So there's all of these plugins nowadays that don't affect latency, which is awesome. But there's some that definitely do. And if you have those in your chain, you're going to introduce latency in your monitoring. So you have to watch for those. I think most DAWs, I know Pro Tools does anyways, but I would say most DAWs probably have a delay compensation window where you can see what is happening as far as delay caused by plugins. So you can just throw a plugin on and see if it's adding delay or not and visually check it to see if you're good. Sometimes you just have to make them inactive and just track without them though.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're in Cubase, a cool trick here is there is a feature. I don't know where you enable it. I always have it enabled, but you'll find it out. So when you open the mixer window in Cubase, you can choose what parts of the racks you want to display. So you can choose if you want to see the inserts or the EQ, the built-in channel strip, the sends, whatever, the inputs, outputs, phase, or I don't know, like all these things. And you can also enable a little latency window or like display. So above every fader, there's a small box where it just shows you the latency that this track causes. So right now I have in this session here, there's a track that I'm not using. It's just in the template. And this track causes, there's a lot of plugins on it, and it causes 190 milliseconds delay. So that's a lot. And if I would have that enabled and record through that channel, or if it was just enabled in the session, there would be a lot of latency. But I can see, by quickly looking at it, I can immediately see which channel is causing the latency. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a thing called delay compensation in all DAWs, modern DAWs, where it kind of does math and tries to solve these problems for you. And up to a certain amount, it can do that in quick enough for you to be able to record to. But that button can be turned off, either by accident or for some mysterious reason. And you'll probably notice pretty quick, if you had a full mix and you turned off delay compensation, the whole mix would just turn into a smushy pie of garbage. So find out where that button is, because you'll always want to be able to just go make sure it's on.
Yeah.
Delay compensation should be on.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you do if you have a session that's you already mixed a bunch of stuff, or you did some stuff along the way, during recording, and the mix is already pretty far, but you still want to do some overdubs, and all the plugins are just there, and you no matter how low you set the buffer size, it's not possible to record without latency, or if you set it low enough, then the computer isn't able to process it anymore, the CPU is not enough anymore. So what do you do in those cases?
I mean, it almost has to be a CPU issue, because I can just set my recording track to a different output, and it'll compensate all of the other tracks to allow me to record in time. But because it's CPU, which is definitely possible in the situation you're explaining, I would just do a bounce. So I would render everything I've got into a mix, essentially, and then bring that mix into a new session or whatever, and just record to that. So there's no plugins. I just have a reference track that I'm tracking to, which works.
Yeah.
I like having all the tracks there, so I can adjust what I'm hearing really easily. But this totally gets me out of that in a pinch.
Yeah.
I'm doing that later today, actually.
Yeah, that totally works. Another option is that you'd use direct monitoring, so you don't monitor through the DAW, but you just monitor the direct input through your interface or the software that comes with the interface.
Yes.
Problem with that is that doesn't work obviously with amp sims or anything that you need to have in the DAW and you want to listen to it. But if you record a vocal or some acoustic instrument where you just need to monitor the dry signal, or use the built-in effects of the interface or something, then you could just not monitor through the DAW and the problem's solved, basically.
Yeah.
That's an option. Or you can, I don't know if all DAWs can do this, but you could freeze tracks. So there's in Cubase, it's called freeze. I don't know what it's in Pro Tools.
That's the same thing. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So if you click freeze, it will render one track that has a lot of plugins in it, and it will you still have the same session open, but you can't tweak the plugins anymore until you unfreeze it. So that frees up some resources for recording, and when you're done, you can just click that button again, and all the plugins will be there for you to tweak again. So that's also an option. Yeah.
Yep, definitely.
Cool. Latency. That's a big one. Then noise or weird artifacts or stuff like that in your signal. So there might be pops and clicks. So everything might be working fine. You hear audio, you have signal, there's no latency. But when you play it back, or even during recording, you notice that there is some weird pops or sounds that shouldn't be in there.
Right.
Yeah. So what are some common reasons for that?
This can be quite a few things. It could be your computer having a hard time kind of keeping up with the buffer. So it's just not processing properly, or your interface is set to a wrong clock, because essentially your computer and your interface have to communicate and clock to each other. And if they're not doing that, it starts introducing things like pops and stuff like that. Both Benny and I run a program called SonarWorks Reference, and that can sometimes introduce some weird artifacts and stuff like that. And usually it's just in monitoring, so, but if you don't know what's going on, it can be a little concerning, I think.
Yep.
So I think usually my default solution for that is just double checking that everything is set to the same settings. So if I'm recording, at 48K, my session needs to be at 48K, my interface has to be set to 48K, and SonarWorks also has to be set to 48K. So anything that needs to communicate is all aligned. That's that should solve the problem. And if it doesn't, I guess you might have some problems.
Yeah, exactly. And with the clock, it could also be that you expanded your interface with an additional preamp, for example, that's connected through a digital connectors like ADAT or something like that. And if that's the case, you have two converters working together. So both devices convert analog to digital, and then it gets summed, and the digital, or it doesn't get summed, but like there's one stream of digital data to the computer, and all the digital devices before the computer need to run off the same clock. So you need to set one as the master and one as the slave. That's the common terminology for it. And if you have to, or like some call it internal clocking and external clocking or something, and if both are set to internal, those clocks are both pretty accurate, but not exactly the same. So there's a slight drift in time, and then that causes pops and clicks. So you need to make sure that there's one clock that's like master over everything. And that can be an issue.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. Another common one is not missing crossfades.
Oh, yeah.
Like, so if you record two clips that are butted up to each other and there's no fade connecting them, they can pop or click, I guess. And that just means you just have to have a little crossfade, and you should always check every little fade. and this is just kind of part of what we do recording music, is you just crossfade clips together and make sure that the edit is smooth. The less information at the fade, or at the cut, sorry, I should say, the less likely there will be a noticeable noise, like a click. But if there's a lot of information, that's when it starts happening. And yeah, I don't know. I crossfade everything regardless to if there's silence there or not. It's just kind of like, no matter what, every clip will have fades on either side.
Yeah, same here. Absolutely.
Learn your hotkey for fades, and then just that'll just become like a habit. You'll just be like, Command A for me is like select everything on that track. Command F is fade, or I can just click F, and then it's done.
Yeah, same here. Do that. Do it no matter what. Don't even look at it if there's a fade. Just make one. And then, yeah, exactly. Awesome. Then another noise issue can be hum that's in the signal. That can also have a couple of reasons. So sometimes there's a ground lift button on certain devices. You just click that button and see which of the two positions works. So yeah, you often don't know, but sometimes one works and the other doesn't. So if that solves the problem, the hum goes away. It's on DI boxes or splitters, something like that. Some bass amps or solid state amps have this as well. Yeah. Check the ground.
It's always worth having a DI around just for that feature. Even if you're for some reason not recording a DI, which you absolutely should, having the ground lift is super handy.
Exactly, yeah. And also, what often solves this problem is if you put all the devices in one chain, if you connect them to one power outlet, that often solves the problem. So where you can run into issues is, for example, if you have two rooms and can't even be in the same room. So you have a pedal board in one outlet and then an amp in the other, and then the interface in another one, and that can cause hum. And if you connect all of those things to one like power strip or something, that often solves the problem.
Right, definitely.
Then also what can introduce noise is just the way you sit with your guitar or bass. So sometimes just turning around in your chair can eliminate noise. It can be lights or whatever is in the room. Like depending what your pickups point at, it can cause noise. And if you just turn around a little, it's gone.
Yeah. The guitars are just like big antennas essentially. So you got to figure out where the sweet spot is usually, especially with single coils. This is where it really is important. They just like seem to pick up the most interference, and you just rotate until you find like the magic spot.
Yeah.
You hear stories of people like literally lying on the ground on their back because it sounds best like that. You just got to find your magic spot where there's not a bunch of noise, and you're just increasing your like signal to noise ratio, and that is always a good thing.
Yeah, totally. Sometimes batteries instead of power supplies is the workaround. Sometimes there's just a hum when you use a power supply with a pedal and you don't know how to get rid of it, or like it just doesn't work. Then just use a battery and it's gone oftentimes. So that can be a solution. You have to make sure the battery's full though, because if those run out of power, you can also get noise again. But a fresh battery often solves the problem.
Right.
And also good power supplies. Sometimes people use some cheap power supply that technically works, but it's just bad. And then it picks up all sorts of noise. That can also be the case. So a good power supply or battery. With the hiss, like hum is one thing, hiss is another one. Usually hiss is something that analog gear introduces, and it's often a gain staging issue. So if you have very low input, like very low signal going into a device, and then you crank the output of it to make up for it, it can cause hiss and noise.
Yeah.
You have to get the levels right. So you have to, the goal is to achieve, as Malcolm just said, a good signal to noise ratio. And with analog gear, you do that by adjusting the input signal to the sweet spot where this distance is like the biggest possible. And if you feed a very low level signal into an analog device and then crank it afterwards, it can just cause noise and hiss.
Yes. Yeah. This is an especially annoying thing for guitar players, I think, with the distorted signals and stuff like that. You know, it's hard to like learn what's acceptable because there is going to be some.
Yeah.
Generally, there's going to be some noise, and you have to learn what's like okay and what's not okay. I think monitoring a DI is a good step. Your DI should be pretty darn clean.
Yeah, it should, totally. Then the high noise floor also can be if you're accidentally recording in 16-bit, for example, and not 24-bit. Mm-hmm. So because if you're in 24-bit, you can record really, really, really quiet signals and then turn them up afterwards, and there will be almost no noise. There's just a very, very large dynamic range that you have that you can use, and the noise floor is super low. Without explaining why that is, you don't need to know the technical details. It's just a fact that with 24-bit, you can record very, very, very quiet signals. There's even people I've read an article once of an engineer who records mics without mic preamps, just straight into the converter, like a ridiculously low signal, and then he turns it up afterwards in the DAW, but that's the cleanest possible signal he can get from the mics. And with 24-bit and a good converter, this can work. So there's still no noise.
I mean, 32-bit with that situation would be like absolutely fine. So I mean that's pretty wild. Who is that?
Totally wild. I've read I don't remember the name. I have to look it up. He uses some crazy expensive converters, and he does like classical music and stuff, and so he uses very, very super detailed high-end microphones straight into some voodoo converter, I don't know, and then he doesn't use mic pre's and like
Holy cow.
Yeah.
Wild. I wonder if that's the future.
Yeah. So, but if you're using 16-bit, for example, then that's a different story. So with 16-bit, and that was the case back in the day when digital was not as good as it is now. When you recorded a very quiet signal and then you turned it up, there was noise. So people tried to record pretty hot signals to avoid that, but you don't need that anymore. You can leave a lot of headroom and don't run into noise issues. But if check the bit rate. If you're accidentally recording in 16-bit, or you have some cheap, I don't know, like a mixing desk with a built-in converter that can only do 16-bit or something, that could be the issue. And if that's the case, you need to record hotter signals. Yeah,
definitely.
Right.
So this is kind of related, but if you are getting weird things like you bring in a track to your session and it's playing back at the wrong speed, like slow or fast, or your whole session, you open it up and all of a sudden your song's just at like a totally different tempo. Those kind of weird things where you sound like a chipmunk, that is because your sample rate settings are incorrect. And Benny and I were just talking about having issues with our interfaces behaving. This stuff happens. So you just have to watch for that. It's really easy to fix. You just have to go to your interface settings and correct it usually. So either your session or your interface are set to the wrong thing. And once you sort that out, you should be fine.
Yeah. And there's a way to check that if you are, like in Cubase, it's if you go to the pool where all the data, like the folder where the actual audio files are stored, it shows you what sample rates those files are in, and then you can compare that to the setting in your DAW, and if it's not the same, then it's weird. Or you can just, if you're on a Mac, you can just right-click and I don't know in what the English
get info.
Get info, yeah, exactly, and then it shows you the sample rate of the WAV file.
Yeah,
and you can check
in Pro Tools, there's a session button, so it's like Command 2, and it brings up all the data of the session, and then you can see what sample rate that session's at. Now, this is important actually, because I think a lot of people probably are self-recording, but with multiple members, so maybe the two guitarists both have recording setups, and they're sending tracks back and forth. Communicate what sample rate and bit rate you're recording at for the entire project, and just stick with that.
Yeah.
So somebody isn't recording at 16, 44.1, and the other person's recording at 24, 48. I mean, that's not going to be the end of the world, but you should just default to always doing the same thing and both being on the same page.
Yeah. Listen to our episode on checklists where we mentioned that.
Yes.
If you have a checklist for your sessions, that doesn't happen because everyone follows the checklist and everyone has the same sample rate setting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely.
Okay, then sometimes the CPU just overloads, like it's with an old computer or whatever reason. If that happens, again, the buffer size could be the issue, so you have to raise the buffer size. If you're not recording, if you're just mixing or editing, you can set it up. You can set it pretty high because latency is not a problem. So too low buffer size can cause the CPU to not be able to keep up anymore. There's also a thing called ASIO guard in Cubase. I don't know if that's a Pro Tools thing as well, or I don't know if it's...
I don't think so.
In Cubase, it's called that way. If you click that, it's an additional buffer that doesn't affect recording, but it affects like reading and writing automation. So if you increase that buffer, then automation is not as accurate anymore, but there's an additional buffer for the computer to process things. So you can play with that. And then, some DAWs have a checkbox. Cubase has it where you have to enable multi-processing or multi-core processing. If you don't enable that, it will process everything on 1 or 2 cores. I don't know. So if you have a 6, 8 core or whatever machine, you might not be able to utilize all those cores until you check this box.
Right. Yeah. Look into the settings for your DAW to see how you can get it to behave best with your computer. There's always these little settings that really do make a difference. I just found one after like 4 years of running this computer as my studio computer. I found one that enables me to like always run my better graphic card. My computer has 2 graphic cards. And so I click the button and it now only uses the good one and my computer runs like a top. It's way better.
Yeah, that was pretty annoying. It was the same for me I have the same computer and it was the same thing. And when the laptop switched between the cards, there was always this weird like blip where this weird artifact on the screen. I didn't know what was happening until I figured out that was when it switched between the graphic cards and it was totally annoying. Yeah.
It was essentially if I like stopped playback, my computer would go back to the low one. So when I like click play and it was heavy processing, it would crash before it would manage to switch to like I don't know. I think that's what was happening anyways, but it was just not working well. And now it is way better. It's like my computer's on steroids.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes little things like that can help. Also closing other applications, of course, all those things. Like make sure if you're working on audio, you're just doing audio and you don't have like Photoshop and like whatever you have in the background. Just close all that stuff.
Yep, definitely. Committing tracks is another thing. Like, so if we talked about freezing tracks, which is, you could definitely do that. I also like to just commit them. So I like render it permanently. I mean, I've got the old one somewhere hidden away, but it's just like, okay, this is how I want it to sound. I'm just going to commit it. All those plugins are rendered and no longer being used, essentially. So that frees up a lot of resources. And it's kind of my go-to for freeing up CPU power.
Oh, yeah. Good one. Yeah, totally. And sometimes if the DAW just crashes, no matter what you do, it's often not the computer or the DAW. Sometimes it's a plugin. Sometimes it's a weird plugin that you downloaded, or sometimes even like good or well-known plugins do that. Some of the I don't want to talk shit about them, but some of the Slate plugins are pretty problematic and like notorious for that. So there's just some plugins that tend to crash DAWs, and that's a process of just trial and error. Just deactivate certain plugins or like remove them from the system entirely, and you might find one that's just causing your DAW to crash or cause issues.
Yeah, I really do love the Slate plugins, and I love their whole platform. I think it's a great company, but they do have some issues. They normally fix them pretty quick. Their customer service is great. So
exactly.
Not shit talking them. But what I'm trying to stress is you want to pay attention to what you've installed on your computer and how things respond when you insert them into sessions. So with Slate, for example, as soon as I've got a bunch of Slate plugins and I do a bounce, it takes like 4 times longer than if I don't have Slate plugins in the session.
Yeah.
And I have to decide, is that worth it for my workflow kind of thing? So you want to know what the trade-offs are when you bring different software into your sessions.
Totally, yeah. All right, that's it for the technical issues that we came up with. I think that's the most common ones. Let's move to the tone problems. So sometimes it's not an obvious technical issue, but sometimes you just record something and it doesn't sound right, and you hear that it doesn't sound right, but you don't know what to do about it. And this is what we're going to talk about now. So a pretty, very, 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 very common one that I get a lot is guitar cab resonances. So there's a weird whistling sound or a weird noise or a resonant frequency, a weird ring or something to it with a guitar recording that you have to notch out. And if you have to do a lot of those notches, and a notch is a very narrow EQ move that you do in mixing to get rid of those. If you have to do a lot of those, it can kind of take away like the excitement and the character of the guitar, and it's kind of a compromise often. So getting it right at the source is the best way. And it's important to know that every single cab or IR or whatever has some of these or some characteristics and some resonant frequencies, but there's some ways you can go about, like you could use to mitigate that problem. So you can, for example, angle the mic a bit if you're miking a real cab. That sometimes solves it. Sometimes a mic straight up on the cab sounds great, but sometimes if you just angle it a little bit, it's the same tone, but the annoying frequency goes away.
Yep, definitely. Another thing that really works well is just introducing a second mic. You can get some, this takes a lot of practice and skill and knowledge, but there's like the Friedman technique, and that can really clean stuff up. You're just bringing in like one mic straight and another at a 45, and that tends to solve a lot of those problems for me. That's like my go-to solution. Totally,
yeah, because the two mics cancel each other a little bit because of the different angle, and it tends to cancel out this weird frequencies. And it kind of, if you think of it like as a comb or something, like it kind of fills, one mic fills the gaps of the other mic, and it just gets smoother. So that's the way I imagined it in my head, and it just works.
Yeah. Normally we're trying to avoid canceling things out with phase, but in this case, it tends to do it in the perfect spot.
Yeah, exactly. Also, like just choosing the best speaker in your cab is a big one. So you have a 4x12, for example. Sometimes one of those is just not as good, or one is way better than the other. So just compare the speakers, just have someone play at low volume and just listen to the individual speakers, or take the same microphone, put it in front of each speaker and find out which one sounds the best or has the most even like mid-range or whatever, or top end. And that can solve a lot of the problems. Sometimes it's just one weird speaker.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so then cymbal bleeds with drum recording. Cymbal bleed. That means you have cymbal noise or like bleed from cymbals in your close mics. So if you solo the snare drum, you have a lot of hi-hat in there, or a lot of crashes, or sometimes a floor tom mic is pretty close to the right or something like that. And you want to avoid that usually. That's also a pretty common one.
The main thing you can do here is just create distance. Move the cymbals up away from the drums. Now, which is going to make the cymbals louder in the overheads, so it's going to make the shells seem quieter. You have to remember that kind of stuff. But by creating space, that's going to greatly decrease the bleed effect. So the hi-hat being moved like 3 inches over is going to make a huge difference on your snare mic, for example. So that's definitely the first thing on the list, I think, for cymbal bleed.
Totally. Also, just trying different cymbals if you can, like quieter cymbals, darker cymbals helps a lot. Sometimes the amount of bleed is not the issue, but sometimes the bleed just sounds weird. Sometimes if it's just darker or more pleasing sounding, the bleed is all of a sudden not an issue anymore. So
that's a great point. I don't mind bleed at all if it sounds fine.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the reasons why I love condenser microphones on toms, because there's the same amount or even more bleed than with dynamics oftentimes, but the bleed the off-axis sound tends to sound more pleasing to me, not as harsh.
Yeah, cool.
So that's cool. That's one thing.
Yeah, and then another thing would be just, I always coach the drummers I'm working with to try and hit the cymbals lighter, almost always. So smash your drums. Like, it's hard. I want that really, really hit, but to get the cymbals light, that'd be great.
Totally. Use the off-axis of the mic. So, like, use a directional mic and point it at the drum in a way that the null is like pointing to the cymbal. So if there's a cardioid mic, like straight, like 100 degrees in the back of the mic, it's the most quiet. So, position your mics in a smart way so that you get the least amount of cymbal bleed.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So if you have not enough like attack on a kick drum, for example, if it's just not cutting through, so what you can do is you can tune the better head lower. That sounds counterintuitive if you hear it, because you think it gets deeper, and it does. But at the same time, if there's not as much tension, it adds more click to the sound, more definition. So I like to do that. If it's like really tight, it tends to sound like jazzy, more boomy, less click, less articulate oftentimes. So try that.
Definitely.
Yeah, there's a thing called Impact Patch or Phalam Slam by Remo, I think. You can put that on the better head. It's like right where the pedal hits, the beater hits the drum. That can at least change the sound of the attack. Sometimes it increases it, sometimes it changes it, but it's worth experimenting with that, I think.
Definitely. Another cool thing is just experimenting with what the beater material is. So often the kick pedal beater will have two sides to it, so you can experiment with that. Some people buy like aftermarket ones to slide in there that have like a different, it just changes how the drum's being hit, and that will change the attack sound.
Totally. And there's tricks like gluing a coin or something to the drum head, and then like all sorts of things. Or
I've done that, and it just destroyed the drum.
Yeah,
or destroyed the skin. I wouldn't recommend getting the metal on there.
yeah, exactly. But there are some like famous metal records that have been done that way. So yeah, experiment whatever you want to do. But yeah, don't blame us if you kill your drum head. Yeah, then the head choice, obviously, like there's some heads that just have more attack and others that have less attack. You have to do a little research here, but the head choice definitely makes a difference. Also, new heads compared to old heads, they sound duller, and like new heads sound fresh and have a more defined, articulate attack.
Definitely.
Yeah, another thing with a kick drum is like a too boomy or too long sort of kick drum. What do you do there, Malcolm, if that happens?
I mean, so much of the drum is just tuning. I love to work with a drum tech on hand because that just makes it so easy.
Yeah.
They're just on it, they fix it. But if something's too boomy, I'm going to probably try and start dampening it. So like getting a pillow inside of it or a blanket or something and pressing it against one of the skins. You can experiment with each skin and see which is kind of causing the offending noise. You can actually even like baffle the drum, like lay a moving blanket over top of it. Sometimes I put panels on it. So maybe it's boomy, but it's not really reaching the room mics or the overheads. So it's not really causing the problem anymore. You can definitely do some cool things like that just to control where the kick is getting in regards to other mics. But first thing I would be doing is probably dampening it.
Yeah, totally. That's also probably what I would do first. But as you said, tuning goes a long way. Sometimes you can get away with very, very little dampening, and it still sounds great. Experiment with the tuning. The relationship between the better and the resonant head is a big one. I tend to have the better head pretty low and the resonant a little higher. But again, just experiment with that and dampen it. But don't overdo it with the dampening because you're going to end up with a dead cardboard sounding like kick drum, and you don't want that probably, and it's going to be too quiet. But
we should mention though, because I feel like a lot of heavier music people are listening to this podcast, and that's kind of something you specialize in, so that's kind of your market. If you're planning to fully replace the kick, baffle, just like mute that thing as much as you can.
Oh yeah, totally, yeah. You basically just want to capture a quick attack sound without any tone so that it's not in the overheads. Yeah, totally. It's a good one. Okay, so then with the cardboard thing that I just mentioned, it's a general thing that when the drums don't cut through and sound cardboardy, like new heads. We've been preaching that all the time. Just use new heads. Like old heads just sound dull, sound like cardboard. It's not good. Yeah. Don't tune well. Use new heads. That often solves the problem right away. And
yeah, I mean that will solve the problem.
Yeah,
unless you just have like the worst drums in the world and they are pieces of cardboard. But if you get new good heads on there, that'll probably do a lot. I would say don't go too thick on the heads. This is totally preference stuff. Like most people, I think, at least over here, like coated heads, which is totally fine. But don't go for like the most thick coated thing in the world because it is just going to be more muted and more muted.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't recommend going too far with that.
Yeah, depending on the genre. And they also like the dampening. Many people overdo it with the dampening. They'll stick like tape and whatnot on the drum heads, and that will totally kill the drum essentially. So you want to use as little of that as possible. and let the drum breathe, let it ring a little bit. Oftentimes the ring is much quieter in the recording than it seems in the room, so loud drums that have a little ring to them are perfectly fine and better than quiet, totally dead drums. Even if you're going for a dry sound, you might be surprised how little of that ring actually ends up in the final mix or the recording. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the ring stands out to us because we're looking for stuff like that. And then once you hear it, you can't stop hearing it because you're obsessing over it. So even though you've maybe like thrown just like a little tiny piece of a moon gel on the skin and it has solved the problem, you can still hear that note because you are now caught onto it and you're just obsessing with it, but it's no longer a problem and you just can't figure that out.
Yeah.
Like I've been down that road, and then you end up with this big EQ notch and then whatever. And then hopefully you just did that in the DAW, and a week later you listen to it and you bypass that plugin and you're like, oh man, that sounds a lot better.
Yeah, exactly. I'd always prefer loud snare drums with a little ring over really dead quiet ones that like don't really cut through. Then I'd take the ring any day. So
some of my favorite albums have ring all over them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because it sounds exciting and lively and just that's better than this dead uninspired piece of cardboard that you hit, basically, that happens when you overdo it with that. So
absolutely.
Yeah. You know what? We are just like halfway through our very extensive list here of problems, and we really want you to be able to keep up with that and make notes and implement all of this. So I think it's a good idea to make this a 2-part episode, actually.
I'm with you, because I also have to leave real soon. So
that's also a good point. But again, I think it's a lot to digest. It's a lot to write down and implement. And we're going to continue next week with the second half of this list, because then we're getting into arrangement, which is a whole other topic. And so instead of like cutting corners here and being very quick, let's just do another one and do it right.
Yeah. And we've got, because we've only really talked about a little bit of guitars and a little bit of drums, and we got all these other instruments to bring up. So, yep.
Okay.
Great.
Awesome. Let's do that. Then thank you so much for listening. That's it with this pretty fast, pretty information-packed episode. I hope that helps, though. By the way, this just gives you the chance, if you have questions that we should, or things that we should add to this list, if you run into issues constantly, let us know. If you do it quickly, we might have a chance to implement that in the next episode, because we're recording these like a couple of days in advance. But I don't know when this airs. Maybe not. Maybe the chance is already over. Anyway, let us know, and maybe we could do another one in the future. But if you want us to add to this list certain things, write us an email, podcast@theselfrecordingband.com. And then
awesome.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for listening. Great. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye.